Now let's go to Tim Duddy, who's going to take us to what are the rules on the land and mining. Something that Tim has quite intimate knowledge of. Thank you, Tim.
By way of some background, and I shall be brief, 6 years ago, BHP came into our lives with a coal exploration licence in a greenfields area on probably what is one of the most fertile agricultural and water resources in Australia, in an area known as Liverpool Plains, some 1.2 million hectares that produces about 37% of the nation's cropping and cereals in its own right. What we discovered as we engaged in a normal law-abiding citizens' way was that the mining industry considered that it was above the law. There was very, very little regulation that was ever enforced, and much of the law that exists in the state by way of the Mining Act, the state water regulations, the Federal Water Act were actually regulated out of being applicable to the mining industry. As a farmer, if I come across Indigenous relics and I run a bulldozer across them, I'm entitled to $1.2 million in fines. As a miner, I run a bulldozer across them, and because I am exempt, I am regulated to deal with Indigenous issues, I am not actually fined under that process. There are 3 officers that enforce breaches of the Mining Act in New South Wales, and recently they upscaled that to 4 officers. So in all the mining projects in New South Wales, if you make a complaint, it might be 2 to 3 years before someone comes to enforce it, and by then your water is destroyed or whatever has happened along the way. The mining industry consider in New South Wales, and I can't speak in South Australia, but I know New South Wales intimately, that money is the justification for everything, and if the water is destroyed, it is simply a basis of come and pay the farmer off, and that's the end of it. In paying the farmer off, also they sign confidentiality agreements so that they can no longer make complaints against that. They stay there, they might stay in their properties, their farms, on the basis that they do sign these confidentiality agreements. The moment those are breached, the mining companies come down very heavily and threaten to litigate against the farmers. This is the most extraordinary thing that has happened in the history of Australia, what is currently happening in the mining industry and what the mining industry is getting away with. What are the solutions? I believe the solutions are a Commonwealth regulation, as there was discussed earlier under the EPBC Act. I have personally been doing considerable work in the office of Tony Windsor, and we have been working on amendments to the EPBC Act to recognise water as an important part of biodiversity, and thereby prosecuting under the Corporations Act if a mining company should destroy significant water resources that are identified from state to state. The only way that we will ever have a nationally recognised standard is to address it from the Commonwealth. You cannot put the hungry fox in charge of the hen house. You cannot put a state-based system that is desperate for mining royalty in charge of its own regulation. It just doesn't happen, it doesn't work. Our community spent some millions of dollars litigating against the mining companies. We won, and in less than 5 weeks, the laws were changed retrospectively. And we weren't the first. That's happened hundreds of times, and it will continue to happen. The only solution here for the future of agriculture, for the future of water, and for the future that mining actually has some place on the landscape is that we have Commonwealth regulation, and the sooner the better.
Oil and gas, mineral interest. As you can see, the majority of the state protected area is under exploration licence for mining activity. Now, the problem with the National Parks and Wildlife Act is that much of our protected areas are what's called jointly proclaimed, which means they're protected and you can also mine them. Makes sense of that. So, you know, we've got a real problem here because people assume that a national park means an area that's protected for the future. Well, that's not the case in a lot of our national parks. The only areas where that is the case is in wilderness areas, wilderness protection areas, and there's a few of those in the state. Prior to the 2010 election, we got commitments, the people of South Australia got commitments from both the Liberal Party, the Labor Party and the Greens to protect a vast area in the Simpson Desert under the Wilderness Protection Act. The map on the bottom corner shows you where that is. It's up at the top border. I mean, Simpson Desert is probably one of the most intact desert systems left in the world from an ecological perspective. Now, you can see a lot of leases across there. They're creeping in there rapidly. There's a massive expansion going on in this area, and the miners are looking pretty closely at this region, one of the most intact desert ecosystems left on the planet. So we're a bit concerned about that, and certainly we're in dialogue at the moment with the mining department, and that's going well, and certainly give them credit with how we're proceeding there. But we do not want another scenario like we had up in the Arkaroola Mountains over the last couple of years. There we saw exploration leases issued in one of the most intact ecosystems in the state, and look what happened. We had an absolute mess. Fortunately, that's been sorted out, but we do not want another scenario like that happening here. So what are our wilderness areas? The Wilderness Protection Act is the highest level of legal protection in the state. It basically is all singly proclaimed, which means no mining, set aside for conservation, which is what we'd assume all of the protected areas to be set aside for. But as you saw in that previous slide, that's not the case. These are maps from the National Wilderness Inventory. The dark blue is high-value wilderness or very intact ecosystems. Now, across the planet, we don't have a lot of very intact ecosystems left. Now, you can see that dark blue area right in the middle there, and we'll hone into that. It's now just below the border there, and that sort of greeny-grey area is the Simpson Desert Regional Reserve, and that's one of the areas that we really need to see protected, and a negotiation needs to happen with the mining industry because we cannot turn one of the most intact desert systems left on the planet into a mine site. That's a bit closer, but you can see the dark blue. And the dark blue is intact wilderness, and as you move away from those colours, it's more and more and more degraded. So that is actually one of the biggest dark blue areas you'll find on the planet. It's certainly one of the biggest dark blue areas left in Australia. So it's critical here that we get this area protected. This is just a bit more detail, So that's a close-up of the area, the Simpson Desert Conservation Park above, the top of Lake here, at the bottom here. This would create a huge north-south conservation corridor, critically important for the state, critically important for all our wildlife to be able to move and adapt to changing climatic conditions, which is what we're facing now. And these are just some photos from the Simpson Desert. It's really quite a remarkable place. It's one of the states, it's one of the countries, it's one of the world's treasures, and it's really not a place we should be mining. Thanks.
We're now moving to look at the advertisements that you've probably been seeing on the TV, and there's two of them. There's one, the two that we're going to show, one that the industry has given us. We'll start with that one, and then we'll get
This is what a CSG well looks like. Wells like this have been extracting natural gas from underground coal seams in Australia for 16 years now. The natural gas extracted is up to 70% cleaner than coal for electricity.
CSG is cleaner than coal.
And each CSG well replaces the need to burn 85,000 tonnes of coal.
We want CSG.
Natural coal seam gas. It's the future.
Well, my major concern with coal seam gas is our future. This is the greatest threat to our country that I've seen.
We rely really heavily on our land, and if they come through and they contaminate our water and land, where have we got to go?
You see these pipelines being placed, next comes the gas wells.
They can walk right over the top of landholders and come on and turn my beautiful property into a cobweb of roads and collecting pipes and a pincushion of wells.
We're seeing these very important, if not key, natural resources being put at threat because once the damage is done, it can't be repaired.
Biggest concerns is the impacts on groundwater. They're very important, the Great Artesian Basin and other underground basins like that.
The trouble is, once it's entered the aquifer system, it'll be in there forever and a day. It's going it's going to really kill the area.
It does concern me when I have two small kids growing up in a gas field effectively.
I have a lady who lives within 200 metres of a gas well. Her young son's the same age as my boy. He was bleeding from the nose as well as the ears. When my son first started developing these headaches, we thought he had a tumour. We've got 11 gas wells around us. What happens when there's thousands of gas wells here?
Just stop this insanity now. Don't let it progress any further.
The whole coal seam gas industry should be stopped until the science of it is known.